Hello everyone, I'm Steven, your storyteller from Stories for Sleep. I struggled with insomnia for many years until I discovered these stories. They changed my health, and now I want to share them with you to help you sleep better. Before you drift off, please like the video and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it for you? Get comfortable and relax. Tonight, we journey back to a time where safety was just an illusion. We talk about a shadow that once haunted the entire American South, a name that history tried to forget. The Servant Girl Annihilator. It is a story about invisible fear and the darkness that lives in the quiet corners of the world. Now, I want you to come back with me to the very distant past, to a time when history itself was still being written. We are traveling to a city called Austin, Texas. Back then, Austin was truly booming. People often called it the city of the Violet Crown because the scenery was so incredibly picturesque, because of the rolling hills beneath the vibrant sunset. Everyone believed life was on the rise. Everyone harbored hopes for a future without trouble. But who knew? Who knew what was truly about to unfold? You see, even in a city so vibrant and full of promise, there were always shadows, corners where the bright light of progress never quite reached. These were the places where absolute isolation was the only thing that truly existed. A persistent loneliness that stretched on from day to day. In the backyards of the prosperous homes were the small rooms known as the servant quarters, where the hired help lived their quiet lives. They were the people least noticed when the lights went out. They lived in solitude, and their loneliness was the only shield they had. They slept in those tiny rooms, in the darkness and the cold sweeping wind. And you must understand the depth of that solitude, that feeling of being utterly invisible. When you are invisible, the world outside seems deaf to any whisper, and every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the wind, feels like a personal threat. They were not just lonely, they were disconnected from the very notion of public safety. That moment of stillness was a lie that was destined to be shattered. They believed that the flimsy doors and old windows could somehow keep them safe. They desperately clung to that peace. But that silence was the calm before the storm, Stephen. A fragile promise. That moment of stillness was a lie that was destined to be shattered. They were alone, and the city was about to forget them entirely when they needed it most. So picture this dark reality. A quiet home, a sleeping household, and only the faint sound of the wind and the ticking clock to mark the passing of time. It was into this fragile, ignored space that the predator slipped. And then, the fateful New Year's Eve of 1884 arrived. Everyone was sound asleep. But in the servant quarters, a cry for help A sound that was cut short and utterly stifled shattered the stillness. An unknown assailant, a faceless shadow, had attacked. This was not just a random crime, but the first crack in the city's entire belief system about safety. The Annihilator had arrived, and he brought no warning at all. The true terror had officially begun, and no one saw him leave. The shock of that first attack left the city paralyzed. The police arrived, but found no clear motive, no logical trail to follow. The fear began to seep into Austin. Not from the violence itself, but from the sheer helplessness of the authorities. They knew a killer was amongst them, but he remained a ghost, an intangible menace. And the killer did not rest. He quickly moved from outright attacks to psychological terrorism. Servant girls began to report strange occurrences. Rocks being thrown at their windows at night. Pistol shots fired through the walls. Someone shaking their doorknob violently. The terror was no longer just about death. It was about the constant feeling of being watched. The paranoia that stretched on from dusk till dawn. They tried to fight back with what little they had. The serving girls began sleeping together in groups, piling furniture against their doors. They bought charms and small amulets, hoping to ward off the evil eye of the man stalking them. They were not fighting a man. They were fighting their own minds. They were fighting the invisible fear. The city's fear boiled over into suspicion and hysteria. The police, desperate for a suspect, arrested over 400 men, mostly men of color. But their efforts were futile. They never found the right man. The Annihilator remained a phantom. When you don't know who the killer is, everyone becomes a suspect. Trust completely dissolved. The fear was exhausting. People started relying on tonics and sedatives sold at the local medicine shops, just to get a few hours of uneasy sleep. They bought every window lock they could find, clinging to the false hope of physical security. They lived in fear not just 24/7, but every single second the sun went down. The tension culminated on Christmas Eve, 1885. The fear had reached its breaking point. The entire city made a choice. They would not run. They chose exhaustion over terror. The community armed themselves, staying awake to face the night. But the true battle was internal. They fought the urge to panic, forcing their minds to stay clear, winning a victory against their own fear. This collective, silent stand against the invisible killer was their final act of defiance. Austin was left with an impossible relief. The killings ceased, but the psychological wound remained. The investigation was dropped, leaving behind the haunting truth. The Annihilator was never identified, never held accountable. The city returned to normal, but everyone knew the peace was fragile. A shadow of suspicion lingered, a deep, unresolvable flaw in their sense of safety. The biggest fear was the knowledge that the menace could return at any time. Austin was left with an impossible relief. killings ceased, but the psychological wound remained. The investigation was dropped, leaving behind the haunting truth. The annihilator was never identified, never held accountable. The city returned to normal, but everyone knew the peace was fragile. A shadow of suspicion lingered, a deep, unresolvable flaw in their sense of safety. The biggest fear was the knowledge that the menace could return at any time. Austin was left with an impossible relief. The killings ceased, but the psychological wound remained. The investigation was dropped, leaving behind the haunting truth. The annihilator was never identified, never held accountable. The city returned to normal, but everyone knew the peace was fragile. A shadow of suspicion lingered, a deep, unresolvable flaw in their sense of safety. The biggest fear was the knowledge that the menace could return at any time. And that is the enduring legacy of the Annihilator. The city learned a simple, haunting lesson, that the greatest terror has no face and no name. It is an anonymous phantom, an unresolved flaw in the safety of the world. And this flaw, this silent crack, is the true darkness that forever lingers in the places we call home. Because when the fear is invisible, it can never truly be gone. But now, it is time to let the story fade. You are safe here, Stephen. Let go of the anonymous shadow. Let go of the silent fear. Feel the warmth of your bed. Feel your breath slowing down. Let the rain outside wash away all the lingering thoughts. I wish you a peaceful night and the sweetest of dreams.